Welcome to SLP Nerdcast. I'm Kate.
And I'm Amy, and we appreciate you tuning in. In our podcast, we will review and provide commentary on resources, literature, and we'll discuss issues related to the field of speech-language pathology.
You can use this podcast for ASHA professional development. For more information about us and certification maintenance hours, go to our website, www.slpnerdcast.com. SLP Nerdcast is brought to you in part by listeners like you. You can support our work by going to our website or social media pages and contributing. You can also find permanent products, notes, and other handouts, including a handout for this episode. Some items are free and others are not, but everything is affordable. Visit our website to submit a call for papers to come on the show and present with us. Contact us anytime on Facebook, Instagram, or at info@slpnerdcast.com. We love hearing from our listeners, and we can't wait to learn what you have to teach us.
Just a quick disclaimer, the contents of this episode are not meant to replace clinical advice. SLP Nerdcast, its hosts and guests do not represent or endorse specific products or procedures mentioned during our episodes unless otherwise stated. We are not PhDs, but we do research our material. We do our best to provide a thorough review and fair representation of each topic that we tackle. That being said, it's always likely there's an article that we've missed or another perspective that we haven't shared. If you have something to add to the conversation, please email us. We'd love to hear from you.
I love it when you read that like a 1920s guy who's like going to rob a bank. That's
trying to
who
be
I have
like
in my mind. And he has like a twisty mustache and like a weird little cap.
In my mind, I'm like the side effects guy for the medication commercial. But
so
yeah.
Good. So what are we talking about today?
Today, we're super excited to welcome back Dr. Nerissa Hall and Hillary Jellison to discuss tele-engagement. Welcome back, ladies.
Thank you. Thank you.
We're very glad that you're here with us because you're very smart and we like you.
We are very glad to be here. Thank you.
You don't need to return the compliment. It's fine. So you guys are here to discuss tele-engagement, which is, I think, another way of saying behavior management during telepractice, or how to keep your clients engaged.
Keeping it fun.
Keeping it engaged. I don't even know what I just said. But before we get started, for our listeners who haven't tuned in for some of the previous episodes we've done with you guys, do you want to tell us a little bit about yourselves first?
Sure. We are two clinicians from Communicare LLC or Communicare LLC in Western Massachusetts. We provide AAC assessments and consultation and training, primarily in the school systems, but we also support early intervention and individuals in adult agencies as well.
So before we get started, we need to go over our disclosures, financial and non-financial. And Amy, I feel like I always try to read through these just as fast as the pharmaceutical side effects guy.
Yes,
so
bring
maybe
your side
it's a
effects voice.
competition.
Maybe, yeah.
How fast can I read it? Okay,
do it.
Let's see.
Okay.
Financial disclosures. Hillary and Nerissa are paid to provide consultation, intervention, training, and assessment in the area of AAC, assistive technology, and tele-AAC. Kate is the owner and founder of Grandbois Therapy and Consulting, LLC, and co-founder of SLP Nerdcast. Amy is an employee of a public school system and co-founder of SLP Nerdcast. Non-financial, Hillary and Nerissa are members of ASHA's special interest groups 12 and 18, AAC and Tele-Practice, and RESNA. Kate and Amy are both members of ASHA SIG 12 and both serve on the AAC Advisory Group for Massachusetts Advocates for Children. I am a member of the Berkshire Association for Behavior Analysis and Therapy, Mass ABA, the Association for Behavior Analysis International, and the corresponding Speech Pathology and Applied Behavior Analysis Special Interest Group. I don't think I did it as fast as you.
I think I win.
Yeah. It was A for effort.
Thanks.
So learning objectives for today, I'm very excited about this topic. I think it's something that a lot of our listeners have wrote in about in terms of how to keep your clients engaged during a telepractice session. As we have said in many other episodes before, we all sort of got thrown into telepractice. You guys are old hats at it, but many of us got thrown into it without a whole lot of warning and scrambled to try and figure out not only how to do it, but how to do it ethically. And then on top of that is how to do it well. So how to really keep your clients participating in the teletherapy session. So I'm very excited to go through all of these. Learning objective number 1, Detail on-site elements that are not necessarily replicated in virtual settings. Learning objective number 2, list at least 3 ways to support engagement in a live synchronous session. Learning objective number 3, list at least 3 on-site tools that can be used to support engagement and or participation.
I'm so excited to learn about all of these things. I think in your previous podcast here with us, you've talked a lot about the different types of service delivery within the continuum of telehealth. And when you're thinking about kind of that other end of the continuum where you're providing that direct synchronous service, that can still be really challenging, even if you have somebody who's, checking all of the boxes to where that's a super appropriate modality for them. I think it can be something that's really hard, especially for many of us who were sort of thrown into this and thrust into the idea of doing teleservices. So I'm really excited to have you guys go through these learning objectives with us today. And I can say for sure that there are definitely on-site elements that don't exactly translate over to the tele environment. So that seems like a really great starting point. Can you guys tell us a little bit about what you've identified as experienced clinicians who have been doing this for a long time? What are those things that you notice and that you think are really relevant for people to be aware of?
So I think, we're still learning them. I think something that we kind of suspect that there are elements that aren't quite the same in an on-site when you compare on-site and virtual settings. Obviously, when we first started thinking about tele-AAC, we were really focused on ensuring that they were as comparable as possible. So we went right in and tried to think about what are those fundamentals that are really inherent to the field of AAC. One of the most obvious ones being, aided language simulation and that AAC modeling, and how do you go from being able to jump on and point to icons or do a visual point prompt with someone's system, and then when you're not in their proximity, how can you start to replicate that same strategy, which we know to be such an integral part of effective intervention and just effective communication with individuals. So I think we were, really focused on proactively looking at replicating, that we almost forgot some of the things that we take for granted. Like, what do we just absorb by being present in the environment, by just being in a space where there could be someone that walks in or warrants, a shift in your attention, or as we're communicating with one another, we're referencing things in our environment. And they're just things that now in a 2-dimensional setting or space, or in a place that isn't shared, those things we kind of took for granted, some of those elements. And then also those things that we do to gain someone's attention or sustain their attention, when we start to see that, they are losing interest or shifting, we can kind of change or be like, wham, and like do something to get their attention. And again, we lose some of that stuff that just happens very intuitively.
That makes a lot of sense to me. I think one thing, having done this for a very short period of time relative to you guys, but is different from real life, real time synchronous intervention, is just the amount of planning and kind of thought that needs to go. I think especially for more experienced clinicians, like you have your clinical rhythm. And so shifting to a different modality, it's not that it can't be of comparable quality, but I feel like for me anyway, I need to be so much more thoughtful about it. And that includes being thoughtful and being able to support the communication partner.
Absolutely. And I think like I'm huge sabotage queen. Like that's my go-to almost for creating these opportunities. And then you get put in this 2D situation and you have to be so deliberate and so much planning going into that sabotaging or creating those opportunities. So that extra planning definitely needs to go in there. One of the things that we have found really effective is just being very transparent and very open with the communication partner or the educator support on the other end. Like, these are our baseline things that we need you to do or to support during this session. so that prior to that session, that communication partner's gotten a list of like, okay, I need to make sure I'm supporting, that attention, or I'm not taking over that session, but I'm kind of stepping back and supporting that communication, the individual in that situation. Because that's not intuitive. That's not something that that communication partner, educator support would know to do. And really outlining those kind of, I think, Nerissa, what do we call them? Like the must do's for tele-AAC that we send out to those partners first.
Do you find that that component of educating the communication partner ahead of the session to be more or less successful depending on how you've communicated to them? Like what is that process of giving them your must-dos? Is it like a handout, or do you find that like a phone call or consult ahead of time is more successful? What does that look like?
I think it varies on the communication partner and their kind of background. What's their baseline on use of services? If they've been around the block in teleservices and they're comfortable with it, then it might just be sending that handout. For other parents, it may be a phone call or a Zoom session, and that first session is more with that communication partner than it is with that individual, just so that they're feeling comfortable with what that next session is going to look like.
Yeah, and I think something that, I think in retrospect, we have learned a lot about what we've had to do. I think Hillary mentioned it earlier, but that forethought and being really explicit about what we're looking for or what they're looking at. And it is particularly important in a tele environment because you're also bringing in potentially less familiar partners, or they don't have as much exposure to just the general. You can't sit back and observe. You're in a much more active role in many ways in this more tele session. But it's really good practice in general. I think we kind of take for granted how much is assumed, like when we are not in this like really highly focused tele environment, and maybe we shouldn't make so many assumptions.
I think like if you're in person and you're sabotaging or you're creating this opportunity for communication, you might be kicking the para or educator under the table so that they're not jumping in with the answer, and you can't do that in the tele session. So you need to give that communication partner that heads up that this is the goal, this is what we're working on in this session, and so, don't answer for the student, or these are examples of how you can support the student in succeeding. And I think that's been one of the biggest hurdles for us with some of our students is the parents or the caregiver or the educator knows the student knows that information and wants that student to be successful and may over prompt in that situation. And so it's important to give that feedback beforehand. We know the student knows this, or we know they can do this. Your best way of supporting the student is X, Y, and Z, and giving them that feedback before the session so that it's not interrupting that session when you only get 20 or 30 minutes for that time.
So it seems to me, as someone who is not doing this anywhere near as often as you guys, and as a consultant, I don't do it very much at all, actually. um, it really seems to me that the success or high rates of tele engagement can be really dependent on the participation and buy-in of the communication partner. And I assume that requires a lot of active feedback, a good working relationship, good channels of communication. Um, I have two questions. The first is, what troubleshooting strategies have you used when that's not going well? Either the communication partner isn't receptive to your feedback or is having a really hard time integrating the feedback to make effective change on their own behavior to support the communicator.
That's definitely a tough one. And it goes back to kind of building that rapport with that communication partner. I can say as a parent, my judgment and my glasses that I look at my own children with is completely different than what their teachers may be looking at. So I think it comes from that empathy and acknowledging that piece of it and working to support that individual with using some clear examples. I know Narissa has done some great work with using that asynchronous model that we talked about, where the communication partner will video some examples of them working with the student and then taking a consult that's a live session to review that and give clear examples of starting out with like, oh, I really like how you did this. You did a great job here. Next time I might tweak this a little bit, but really focusing on that positive. And because we're not walking any steps in the foots of our communication partners that we're working with. And so we really need to acknowledge what their day-to-day life and support, for that student is.
And I think to that point, Hillary, that's, I think, what tele affords us. So in this current situation, in the middle of a pandemic, we are going into the individual's home. That immediately changes turns the table, whatever that saying is. We are, I think it's a unique opportunity to learn from them and to kind of be humbled by, rather than us always delivering the content, like we are now also absorbing the content from their environment and bringing it in. I think we also have, and even if we're not talking about homes, I think what we do have is an opportunity for increased contact. Whether or not it's an outpatient session or a school-based session, often the individual goes to that session and then, it's kind of done in a silo. But in this kind of, we have an opportunity to have more contact, which then I think leads to improved rapport. I think what's important, and this is kind of outside of the scope of this discussion, but it's lots of learning or modulating our own expectations to create like a shared vision of what that looks like. So we may say like, oh, absolutely, we're going to work on X, Y, and Z. But we might have to deviate or change the rate at which we're addressing those or the aggressiveness with which we're addressing them so that we find something that feels comfortable to ensure that we get that buy-in. And I think what we've seen is that slow and steady wins the race. Like these repeated opportunities to connect and work systematically towards building capacity of the individual and their communication partner inherently also works on building that rapport, which then we have that sustained buy-in, which then we have the opportunity to have a more comfortable conversation about how I love what you did right there, but let's try something different next time. And that feels kind of more authentic and not as much of like when you have less contact and you're trying to provide that kind of feedback, it feels a little bit, I don't know, like a little bit more authoritative.
Well, you don't have that relationship to build off of. That makes a lot of sense. I mean, nobody really wants to be giving critical feedback by a source that they don't trust or a source that they don't feel comfortable with. So that makes a lot of sense to me. My second question was related to these engagement components when there is not a communication partner. So in the instance where you have someone participating who is participating in synchronous therapy without I'm sure there are other communication partners on the other side of the screen, but they might not be sitting right there. Or how does that? What kind of supports have you used in that situation?
I think you bring up a great point. So it's so good to contrast those two scenarios. You're in one, you have to really design your materials and your presentation of materials mindfully to be able to either have yourself organized enough that you can cycle through a series of activities. If you obviously want to make sure that they are tapped into what motivates the individual, their area of interest. I think that there are ways of organizing your screen so that you can also help draw attention. So even if you don't have like a really powerful annotation tool, you could put things in the purple box in the top left and you can say, oh, what do you see up there in the purple one? And then, I mean, even if you're working in PowerPoint, you could have content in the next one, and then you can change your slide, and then you have a yellow box in the bottom right corner. So you are creating movement. You're creating, you're implementing elements that can help draw attention to certain things. You can also have very sophisticated software that allows you to highlight or illuminate or manipulate. You can use things like Smart Notebook, and you can create movable elements on a screen. You can give shared control. So we're really focusing, like when we think about the actual content that we're either using or developing, we want to look for different features that involve color, movement, annotation, because you really are restricted to that two-dimensional environment in which you have to be able to gain and draw attention.
And I think what we found with even with our younger kiddos, when there is a communication partner and you're doing this tele service or tele AAC, you're first looking for visual engagement. You want them to recognize that there's something motivating on the screen that's occurring that may interrupt what their other behavior is that's occurring. So for many of our students, some of them would join a telesession and they already have an iPad with YouTube running. So then you're like, all right, I'm competing with YouTube here. How am I going to bring it to get that attention? And so you're thinking of the auditory, like Narissa said, that movement, or getting that visual attention, and then you're shaping that behavior and reinforcing, okay, I saw him look at the screen with this. I'm going to acknowledge it. We're going to continue to reinforce that support. When thinking of some of those kind of younger kids. If it's an older student that's more independent without a communication partner, your setup for that session is going to look slightly different as well.
And I'm glad that you brought that up, because I've also been able to see some really well-designed programs that kind of build in a consistency and a routine to it. So they'll use like a structured PowerPoint or Google Slides that almost does like a tech check readiness type of thing. Like, are we here? Are we ready? And then they'll even just start with, a series of slides that are almost like a visual tracking, like find the one that's here and then there. And it's, kind of like a behavioral momentum or a readiness that ensures that we've got that focus and attention. So yeah, you just reminded me of that. I think also to go off. So, and then I think when we have a communication partner there, to Hillary's point, like a lot of the stuff is the same. But what's interesting and that we've learned along the way is that back to that point of that explicit conversation that you have, or the sharing of information of the must-dos or to-dos, is just being really explicit about what it means to help shift an individual's attention. Like you are the conduit between the clinician on the side and the individual, and that takes a different way of talking about the scenario. So oftentimes we see just its basic intuition. Say Hillary pitches a question like, who works on a farm? And the partner tends to say something like, is it a farmer or like a firefighter? Instead of saying rather, I don't know, who works on a farm? Let's think about that. And we know quite intuitively how to serve as that conduit or that extension of the clinician. But we found that, it's almost like engagement strategies that you have to teach to the partner about being that narrator rather than the prompter.
So the other day when I was joining in on a speech session with a youngster and their mom, he was engaged in the activity and then he was not. And so as the consultant kind of observing, I then held up my light tech icon, which I'm not going to find right now. Oh, I am. That said mine, it's my turn. I'm going to pick something. And so then I was able to use my words that mirrored what the student had to give a request. And the speech therapist was like, oh, I love that. I didn't even think of that. Being able to model my turn and I'm going to make a request when he wasn't engaged, and then kind of shifting that focus. So it isn't always the expectation of the student to complete the task or response, just like we would in person. I think sometimes, unfortunately, that session, we have like a mind block of what we would typically be doing in person. And if we just generalize that idea, we would be thinking of it.
You know what it's making me think of? And the three of you could just tell me that I'm so wrong. But when you first start working with AAC, the equipment seems like this barrier. And then over time, you're like, oh, well, it's just speech therapy. It's just what I was trained to do with this thing, with this extra piece of paper, with this, a piece of technology. And it's just a funny parallel to me, because you're right. So much of this we already do. It's just through this medium, you have to either, it seems like you have to find other ways to go about getting to it's the same goal that you're getting at. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. I totally agree with you. And I think we get stuck with it. Like I was saying.
Thank you for validating me.
No problem. Anytime. I was telling Narissa, I think we totally get stuck in this idea of tele environment, and we're missing, like, our focus is communication, and it's just figuring out how we're delivering that. How are we creating this engagement to create communication? Because communication is going to occur when there's something that's motivating, engaging, and communication is sharing the ideas back and forth. And so creating that environment which supports that piece of it. We don't want students to be great at tele-AAC.
Absolutely.
We want
and
them
I think
to be
that's
great
where
at communication.
we so often get, well, what software would you use, or what's the best? It's the, I think, and then I watch some sessions where they kind of go through 10 pages of a book to make sure that they get the right data. Whereas some of the most effective things are just like silly photos that you're like, what? Like, what is that? And making it fun, and keeping that motivation at the forefront, and being able to, I think so how can we do that in the content that we present? So either just having a array of different material that can get to that, can keep communicating, keep the communication and the goal acquisition motivating, because you are contending with a few extra barriers in terms of the tech, the teletech and the AAC tech. Not always stressing about it always involving a high-tech device, because we've got the clash of the tech right there. And while we can certainly do it, we also want to have those comment cards that Hillary mentioned. We want to have the alternatives. But then there are also things that we can do in terms of our own environment. So Hillary is kindly placing a series of comment cards. I need a minute. She even had her flat Hillary picture come out.
Nobody can see
So good.
what's happening.
Good.
I almost just died of laughter. She just held up a flat cardboard version of herself onto the screen. Can you? Why would you use? I assume that's like a flat Stanley.
Flat Hillary.
That's a flat Hillary.
Except it's a flat Hillary. And
For
I
those
would like
of you
to
who don't
share.
know that book, it's a book, Flat Stanley. Tell us more.
So we did this during camp, again, as trying to reach out into the students' own environment. So they each got their...
So it's a picture of Hillary's face on top of a drawn body.
Yeah.
I would love to think I look like this. My body is like hiking and like sturdy. And so each student in your group got these. So again, it's kind of reaching out into that environment. And so this was during our outdoor week, and they were supposed to take us out on different activities or do some of their art activities with us. And the students loved this. This is not high tech. This is a simple copy and paste, although Nursa did an excellent job on drawing the body. A simple copy and paste, and I will tell you, some of my students still have their flat Hillarys and their folders they take to school back and forth with them.
This is amazing. So for people who can't see this, this is a, 8-inch tall cutout of a person dressed in clothes with Hillary's head
It's a flat Hillary.
taped onto the
Fantastic.
body. And it's just, it's amazing.
It is laminated, so it's slightly waterproof.
And I will say that I've seen them be used outside of the context of that activity. Talk about a surprise event when you all of a sudden move your head out of the screen and your avatar comes up in paper form, it's like, or you all of a sudden take your flat Hillary and they fall off. Like, that's kind of some of those unexpected events that by having these props, you can kind of create that clinical moment where you entice communication or you change it up. And I think that also gets us thinking about green screens and how you can use, one of our clinicians, she created a green screen and put pockets on it. So then when you overlay your virtual scene and you all of a sudden take either your flat clinician or your icon or your word and you pop it into that green screen pocket, it vanishes. And it's like this unexpected thing that happens, and you've created a clinical moment in this two-dimensional environment that kind of replicates some of that fun silliness that is so critical to that in-person on-site dynamic.
For one of the students, we took Google Earth, and it was our outer space theme. And so we each had like our outer space helmets on, and he chose the location of his school and we were traveling down to it. So he was using his like light tech icons to tell us, let's go down, and then we were like, okay, hold on tight, here we go. And so the screen, the visual referent he could see was Google Earth traveling down to the school, and he was directing us on where we needed to go with it. I think when we think of our students with complex communication needs, there needs to be a visual reference for that communication to happen and to have that shared meaning. And so for some students, it could be a static picture. For other students, it needs to be like a video virtual background behind you or the green screen. It's really goes down to knowing your student and knowing what kind of motivates them and what support they kind of need in that piece of it.
I feel like the term shared experience is a key piece of that. And it makes it more social and less directive. And I feel like, I'm not doing a lot of telepractice myself, but I'm hearing from my colleagues who are doing it that they're about ready to like never see a boom card again. So many times it's just like, drag the fish onto the pond. There's only, because that's not a shared experience. It's not play through a two-dimensional universe. I feel like that's such a good description.
Well, I feel like you guys have talked a little bit about what is our third learning objective with the flat Hillary. I'm going to go back to the flat Hillary for a second, because you said that when you use them in camp, not only did you have your own flat Hillary, the students had a flat Hillary as well. So I feel like you've talked a lot about some pretty fantastic things.
There she is,
She's
flat
coming
Hillary.
closer and closer and closer. So I feel like what I'm seeing right now is Hillary's flat Hillary, like zooming in on the camera. And that is something that we're doing in that 2D digital modality. But you've also opened the door to, just because the therapy is being provided in a telemodality does not rule out the ability to use some physical materials on the client end.
And should not rule out using physical materials.
So can you tell us a little bit about that? Like, what are at least 3 on-site tools that could be used to support engagement or participation on the client end?
So I think, we've talked about a few, as I think one of the most important things, especially when we're thinking about tele-AAC, is that we put so much emphasis on the AAC system, but we need to have those tools or resources on the on-site environment. Like, they're just, from a troubleshooting standpoint, the ability to, Hillary's doing a great job. She's gone from isolated icons, comment cards, to now a language board that she's got some great movement, zooming in and out, modeling. Yep, that's great. Up, we'll go up. So, we definitely want the light tech language supports. Even if an individual doesn't use them frequently, we've found that we rely on them quite heavily for a number of reasons, especially like if we're in a group activity, or just like the pacing, it takes a long time to compose a message potentially, and there might be things that warrant really quick responses. For some individuals, we've created just kind of more like fun rating scales, like that was awesome, or boo, not a good one, or, just kind of some fun language that, instead of having to think to the point that you guys brought up earlier of like those directed activities, it just gives you an opportunity to kind of talk about it, or say a yay or nay, or have an opinion. So that's definitely one that we want. And then I think we also talked about having, like, if there are visuals inherent in the activity, for many people having them already printed or available, so that, because for a lot of individuals, being able to focus on the person talking is more important than needing to see the the materials shared. And we're talking about a small real estate. We don't have the joy of being able to like use the front stage of a classroom or a therapy room. So we might need to be mindful of having the actual product in their environment. And then there are also the, classic kind of behavioral support tools like token reinforcement systems or first then schedules that I think, again, we don't always want that all embedded into that on screen. Like have to be really careful about the real estate that we use to support the individual's ability to focus on the salient elements. So if they're trying to focus on that face-to-face interaction, we want very little happening in the screen sharing. If we want them to focus on that screen sharing component, we're going to have some other cues or sounds or things like that that help draw them back to us as needed. And if they need a combination of both, we might, need a combination of resources for them.
So oftentimes, or not oftentimes, we always have the clinician has their own token board or visual behavioral modification supports, and then the student has their own on-site visual modification support. So part of that must do for that communication partner that's there is a training on how they're supporting that token. Or if I'm taking a token on my end and putting it on, I want you to make sure that you have a matching one on your side. So it's not taking that visual real estate, but that in person, that student seeing that star kind of going on there.
So when you do bring in some of those traditional behavior modification supports, like when I was working in an outpatient clinic, I could not do a session without my star chart. It was my rock. It was my cornerstone. Sometimes it didn't work, but I had it with me every single session. And if you're trying to preserve the real estate on the screen, what suggestions do you guys have for incorporating those strategies without monopolizing the visual reference on in terms of the digital engagement?
And I think even if you were working with digital only, having that in a separate tab, or having your materials organized in such a way that you can flip from the activity to, and then you're narrating the process so that they're not getting lost in it. Like let's see how many more. I'm going to switch to your token board or to our schedule. You do the switch. They can either manipulate it, like you check it off, or tell me which one to do, or, you can kind of vary depending on the individual, and be like, okay, look, we only have 3 more. So let's switch back to our activity. So, I mean, if we have a large enough screen, you could always have that running neatly on the side, or you can toggle back and forth. I think it's important to narrate the toggle in a succinct manner, just so, because, we all joke when we do meetings and things like that. But I mean, I've had a colleague that would be like, I've taken my Dramamine, as we like scroll through the page or switch. We, really want to limit that, or support the individual's understanding that what we're doing.
And with that caveat being, like, if you're doing Google Zoom, limit the amount of tabs you have open, because it will crash your ability to sustain video. So that's where you may look more at having a Google Doc or a Google Slide that has everything kind of embedded into it that you're navigating. So just, again, that mindfulness of preserving your visual clarity, and what are some strategies to kind of work around that piece.
And I think I've seen, now that it's becoming much more common and we're having to do it, a lot of people really working on those slideshows. So they almost have like a landing page, and then they, it hyperlinks to that activity, and then you come back to that landing page and you hyperlink to the next one. And I think that that's also important in creating that kind of grounding we're in this shared space, and that the routine element to it. So there's a lot to be said for kind of using slideshows or PowerPoints or Google Slides just to help organize and keep it. There are a few things worse than having to tolerate someone futzing through a whole bunch of web pages or things like that. And there are lots of really affordable and free resources that make it super easy.
So what might some of those free resources be, Nerissa?
Well, I think we just talked about, Google for one. I mean, you can basically work within the suite of Google tools, from slides to docs, and put in, if you wanted to do the bit emojis and the avatars and those kind of things, that's all there.
Toilet humor is great that you can throw in there. Go
Yep.
Noodle is great for those movement breaks. I think it's important to remember the learner at the other end. Do they need that movement break? You're going to need to pull in those strategies that you would pull in person. So yeah, using those funny pieces, being silly, and just kind of expanding on those pieces, but making it predictable and consistent for that student. Like, most of our students need that predictable, that expected they know what's expected of them in the session.
And before we jumped on to talking about this formally, Hillary schooled us all in her filters right
True.
within Zoom that could certainly keep things interesting.
And you can download like a Snapchat filter too to use within Zoom. I'm sure you can probably do it within Google Docs.
Yeah.
But even like, we had a session with a student where I had like a boa and a silly hat and sunglasses, and I was putting it on, and he was just engaged because, again, we needed that visual attention and engagement. So it had to be just in that session, and we're putting it on. And I had emailed beforehand, so his educator had pulled whatever weird resources they had so that I could tell him to put different things on. So again, I think it's just figuring out, and that was a kid who needed that hands-on experience. And so how are you thoughtfully planning that experience?
And you ran over it so quickly, but I think it just reminded me, I think one of the lining up your tangibles in both environments is just such a simple, easy way of, and I've seen sessions and run sessions where it's like, wow, look what I have Elsa. She's just like yours. Say hi. There are all sorts of ways of just bringing items. Like, I think it's so caught on having the digital element there that we kind of lose how important it is to have just those real items that are aligned and ready to go.
My session the other day, the kid lost it, hysterical that the dog was misbehaving. Like, who would have planned that? But like, he then was using his device to direct the dog to like stop biting on something. So really, again, taking, not planned, but taking those kind of natural environment, those natural activities that kind of come, and taking those.
I think the way that you guys have sorted it out and is helpful for me to just have a framework about the different things to think about. I can see how part of the appeal of online flashcards and digital kind of tasks like that is in part, especially if you're new to this modality. It's hard for all of us. It's hard for our clients. It's hard for us as clinicians to do too many things that feel new and challenging at the same time. So if your task is kind of rote, then that aspect of it feels easier from a clinician side, while maybe all of these other like tech pieces feel a bit new and challenging and uncomfortable. But I think the overall message is that we can't really sit there as clinicians, just like we can't in our live therapy. Like, if your live therapy is just flashcards, people are probably not having a lot of fun, and that includes your client, and that's really important to troubleshoot. So for me, hearing you guys talk about this,
throughout this whole interview has been helpful, because then at least I can break those pieces apart a little bit, and it feels a little less intimidating, right? It's a little less intimidating to say, just do good therapy on the internet. I can really think about, okay, what are some things that I can do in this 2D digital format? And within that 2D digital format, what can I do visually? What can I do auditorily? What can I do with my organization? And then you can translate that whole framework to physical materials on the client's end. And for me, I feel like that's a really helpful way to think about it, and it makes it feel a lot less scary.
This is making me think back to something that you guys said that was definitely a light bulb moment for me, about how we as humans and as communicators in our society, we share texts and videos, and we communicate with each other over technology all the time. And how, doing therapy through technology shouldn't be that different. It's just another extension of the way that we're connecting with each other as human beings. And all of these things you're saying, it's reminding me of that, because yes, it's through technology, but you're still, if you were Zooming with your long lost college roommate, and you would be, oh, look at my, let me give you a tour of our new kitchen, or look at my dog, or, there are so many ways to connect with other people over Zoom that we do as people, or Zoom or Google or whatever, software you're using. And I think, again, there's that mind block, or whatever you would want to say about, oh, but this is teletherapy and I have to be sitting here having them click on a bunch of different things. You somehow, it feels right to put it in a box, but really it's still communication. You're still a clinician communicating with your client.
Why do you think like it gets to that point? I think we started to talk about it a little bit, or we start to think about putting it in a box or doing, I think, I don't know if it's in school settings in particular, when we have goals and we have these objectives and we have this pressure to gather data, and we have this, maybe we don't understand, or maybe we don't have a clear picture of what it is that we're looking for, or what data can be, because I often, it's the same, it's not unusual to hear like, oh, well, you made it fun. Like, well, since when did it not become, like, where did we lose that? And I think I like even catch it, like for my own practice too, sometimes I have to be like, okay, like, let's just simmer down now. Like, we don't need it to be this intense. And there's so much like that we can, it's just interesting to think about, like, why and where do we lose that, like, along the way.
And I think if we think of, what I'm hearing too from a lot of clinicians is they're feeling like their telesession needs to be on from like start until the end of that 30 minutes. And if realistically we reflect on the in-person session, you have breaks, you have like they're reinforcing and you're writing your note. And I think it's important to be transparent with the communication partner or the parent at the other end to say, we're going to take a movement break in the middle, or, they've done so well, they're going to earn a break. We can check in on some things, or being transparent, like, it's really okay if the student gets up and walks away and then is able to come back to the session. That's a go for us. That's a win, and I think it's reflecting on the other end as a parent, they're feeling like, I need to support and have my child attending and answering every single question from like 12 to 12:30, because that's the only time I have this specialist. And we just need to be honest with each other and realistic in that expectation. And all of us will just take a nice deep breath and we can focus on the goal of the task.
Right. And I, yes, can totally identify with that. And then I think, or just having that comfort in narrating that, it's kind of aligned with that fear that I have to know where all the words are. When in fact, for an individual learning an AAC system, to watch you struggle or to mess up or to be like, oh, like, where is that? Like, that is such a valuable learning experience, as is kind of like working through some of those like glitches.
Hillary, I 1000,000,000% agree with you. I think that that's so true. And I think when we talk about having our expectations be consistent, how confusing is that for a client who you used to work with face to face, and you had all of these movement breaks, and we identified that we were both people and needed to move our bodies or shift our attention or shift our focus or change the activity. And now for some reason in a virtual world, it's just rote responding. That's also a really different routine and probably feels different and not in a positive way. So I think being clear and transparent about it is super important. And I think another thing that connects with that is wait time.
Right.
Because that is hard for people.
Yeah.
And I feel like it's even more amplified in the digital exchange. And that it being really transparent and kind of doing it as you call them your must-dos. I think that that's a helpful thing to say. We're going to wait and it's going to feel like a really long time. And that's on purpose.
Yeah. And it's going to be uncomfortable. And that's where I think we've benefited from being able to do some asynchronous and synchronous. Because if we're sharing asynchronous material of us kind of running an activity and we're modeling that uncomfortable, awkward wait time, then when we're expecting it in that live session where everybody's staring at the screen and the seconds hand is going even slower, it's an expected expectation and everybody is okay with it.
Well, as usual, I'm really inspired after talking to you guys.
I always am. I'm always like, man, my students, they don't have any fun or they don't, I think that this is, I don't want to say you make it sound easy, but you make it sound doable.
Yeah.
You make, this feels like a very doable extension of what we're already doing.
And I think what's hard is when you're in that telesession and if you make those mistakes, sometimes those mistakes cause you to lose the student's engagement and their attention. So I think that's where it also puts that stress on the clinician to, I need to create this engagement and I need to keep it. If I lose it, I've lost the student. And I think to be, to be honest with ourselves that I can lose engagement in a session. It's natural. It's part of our human nature. And to be able to target that communication, what a great communication opportunity to say, I'm bored. I don't like this. You're going too slow. Hurry up. It creates that communication opportunity. But I think as a clinician, we sometimes feel like we always need to be in control and always kind of have that engagement.
I feel like, I don't know, I had a professor in graduate school who used to say all the time, speech pathology is a science and an art. At the same, you have to rely on your science, but be creative and be engaging. And I remember as a new clinician, that was really hard because I was so focused on making sure I didn't totally screw up, which I still screw up all the time, but making sure that I had everything the way I was supposed to do it. And the art part came later when I became more relaxed. And so I wonder if part of that is just, using technology to deliver therapy is just a new skill. It's just something that is new and different, and we don't want to screw it up. We still don't want to mess it up.
I think another funny element that sort of is somewhat unique to the tele environment is the audience factor too. So if I think back to my first job, my CF job, I was in a big outpatient clinic, a community clinic, and they had all of the two-way glass. And I remember being so nervous that people were sitting behind that glass and watching me, and I was on display, and I felt, insecure about what I was doing. And then you acclimate to it, and then you don't even think about it at all. And then you come out the other side and you're like, oh, this is great. People are watching, and I can have a conversation afterwards about the strategies. But that initial period, it's uncomfortable and it's the forefront of your mind. You're like, oh my goodness, people are watching. And I think that is a piece that's a shift for a lot of clinicians, I think, especially in a school where you're not accustomed to having an audience like that. So that is another piece that I think will you probably get more comfortable with. And then at the end, you get to the point where you're like, this is fantastic. I can talk to the communication partner. It's so amazing. I love this. But I think for a lot of people, there is this nervous feeling of, and then you feel like if it's not going well, people are having thoughts about you and your efficacy, and like, there's a whole road you can go down there with
I
nervous
think that's
feelings.
such a good point. I mean, particularly for those of us who are not used to doing therapy in front of a caregiver or a stakeholder or a parent or a guardian. And particularly now in pandemic times where you might be one of the few people who's interacting with that family, or, sort of there is a perceived amount of pressure. I guess at least at first until you acclimate to it.
And I think what's actually like, it's just making me think just in this dialogue between us, like, something that, again, we're constantly exploring this field as we apply it more and more, but maybe that's also, just as you mentioned, Amy, like things that start to support that engagement is that you have this I mean, we talked earlier about that rapport, but that, you know, being able to work in this kind of two-dimensional environment where you do have this observational, but bringing it to light and talking about it. And I think it also warrants like this transparency that I think starts to just also ultimately create a successful dynamic and rapport, like, oh, it's even being able to say like, this is messy, or I'm not too sure. Or, oh, this tech, or, I think that there are different ways that also make it, I found that I've been able to better connect with parents um, in this kind of a dynamic, but also by being vulnerable enough to be like, that did not work how I want it to be, or, oh, that was a rough one. I'm going to have to do some work. Like, and that is, you don't ever want to have to admit that, but I think it also makes you human. And then you start to connect on a totally different level. And then that's kind of and then ultimately you're indirectly supporting engagement, because now here's this human person connecting, and I'm taking all of Hillary's points.
And I think that's where, like, as a consultant coming in, that was exciting to be able to jump into a speech session and support the speech therapist, for the speech therapist to kind of see that interaction, what you would do in that situation, and for the parent to see like, wow, I'm supported by this great team that's working together, and yes, they make mistakes, but they're honest and they acknowledge and they learn from those different things that happen. And so as a consultant, I think it's important that we're joining in on these sessions to support the clinicians in those tele sessions.
Well, and it's nice to have support too. I think a lot of times, we're all islands in our own jobs. Like, having worked, like, before I went back to school for speech therapy, I was a paraprofessional public school program for like a very long time. And the program that I worked in, like, you were an island. You worked with the student, you went about their day with them, and you had thoughts, but the opportunity to check in with someone, the opportunity to be the communication partner in a well facilitated session is also a really cool thing. It's a really cool thing that you can do with teletherapy. You can get access, you can attend a speech session that you might not have attended otherwise, and any strategies you're learning, you're able to implement that all day. And the same, for parents, for guardians. So it's a cool, it's a really unique way to be able to address a lot of different partners without a lot of logistical barriers.
I feel like this was all a tremendous amount of information. Is there anything, I'm sort of glossing over our learning objectives. We've touched on all three of these pretty in quite a bit of detail, but is there anything that we left out, or that you guys left out, that you feel is really a crucial component to tele-engagement? Or do you have any words of wisdom and advice for our listeners who are presumably listening to this to get more ideas about effective tele-engagement?
I don't know, but I think leaving knowing that we know how to do this. We do this. We do this, it's no different from the things that they just look slightly different in this format. But that it's totally doable, and that there are lots of, little things that can go a long way. I mean, we certainly have covered a ton of stuff. but none of it's necessarily rocket science. It's things that we have in our toolkits, things that are available. And I think I don't know. Hillary, what do you think?
I agree with what you're saying. And I think there's tons of resources out there if you Google or look for speech therapy with a green screen. I know we've shared some Tech Tuesday ideas with how to incorporate the green screen or the visual or the snap filters. There's tons of resources out there on using boom cards or some of that technology. The important piece is remembering the goal of your session and making sure that we're not losing sight of that goal by adding extra fancy bells and whistles.
And making sure, I mean, one of my takeaways from listening to you guys is staying focused on the fun and the exchange and the relationship.
I was just going to say, if you haven't found her already, you've got to track down Hillary and how she does her activities, because it is just like fun in a box. It involves props and expressions and goofiness and wait time.
Or as simple as the other day, it was with a teenager and we were talking about how to hold a conversation with a girl. Like, you need to have conversation starters. And so we were just talking about how to have, I was like, all right, throw a topic at me. We're going to brainstorm how we're going to hold this together. And he chose water. And I was like, oh, we got this. And he did for 2 minutes.
That's impressive, right? Given the topic of water. That's pretty good. Well, for those of you out there who are new to the amazingness that is Hillary and Narissa, they offer is it a mailing list, a newsletter that goes out every Tuesday called Tech Tuesdays that has lots of really great information and resources. Your website is tremendous and full of resources. I know we've talked about that on here before. It's aaccommunicare.com. So cruise on over to there, watch all of the amazing things. If you haven't taken any of their webinars, we're their biggest fans. It's getting embarrassing at this point, but their webinars are really so good and full of video. They're full of video clips that demonstrate a lot of the things that we've talked about. I know podcasts are purely audio, but if you are looking for some visual supports to support your learning in this episode, cruise on over to their website. And as always, we're tremendously inspired by both of you. So thank you again so much for joining us. If anybody has questions, you can reach out to us at any time, info@slpnerdcast.com. You can also cruise on over to aacommunicare.com and send them any questions if you have them. Thank you so much for joining us, and we hope to see everybody here again soon.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.